If there is one thing about Anne Boleyn that fascinates almost everyone who loves Tudor history, it's discussing what on earth she actually looked like. A subject which is as contentious as when she was born. Hashtag Team 1507, if you ask me. All we have to go on, at least for now, is a series of portraits painted after Anne Boleyn's death, and that damaged medal which was struck in 1534. But is it just possible that a portrait of Anne Boleyn painted from life has been hiding in plain sight all along? Well, today I hope to answer that question as I speak to Elizabeth LaVasse, who has been researching Anne's many images and has developed what I think could be an incredible theory which, if true, will take the world of Anne Boleyn portraiture by storm. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 73, Anne Boleyn, A History in Portraits with Elizabeth LaVasse. Welcome to the Tudor Chess Podcast, Elizabeth LaVasse. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good, pleased to have you. I'm going to say now, listeners probably can tell my voice sounds a bit off. I have actually got a chest infection, but I was so keen to talk to you. I've been guzzling honey and black tea to try and make it happen. So we're here today to talk about your study that you've conducted, Anne Boleyn, A History in Portraits, which I'm so excited to talk to you about because I think you're on the cusp of something really, really exciting discovery-wise. Before we get into that, just a few questions to get to know you a bit better. So could you provide me with a short introduction into your background, so where you grew up and what you now do full time?
So I was born in Italy and I moved to the United States when I was 2 years old. I currently live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a mom of 5 and full time I am the CEO and president of We Get It Foundation. It's a nonprofit that I founded to support the neurodivergent community. I am also a special education advocate in the United States, and now I'm an author.
And a mum of 5 as well, you said?
Yes.
Wowzers. I bet that keeps you busy.
Absolutely.
So what sparked your passion for Tudor history? I didn't get any sense of Tudor stuff in there, so I'm just curious to know where that passion came from.
So I always grew up with this story that since we were moving to the United States, they wanted to find a version of my name that would be appropriate in the United States. And so my mom actually asked for a dictionary and found Queen Elizabeth I and wrote down the spelling of my name the same as hers. And so I always felt very connected to her, just as not only as like somebody who shares the same name as me, but as a person in history who was incredibly strong at a time when, it was pretty unheard of women to rule.
Yeah. So is that based on the comparing it to the spelling in Italian, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense. So if you could pick a single moment from history to go back and witness, you could jump in a time travel machine. Do you have one? What would it be?
Yes, I'd actually love to see the coronation of Queen Mary I. I just wonder, I know you may have thought I was going to say Elizabeth. I just wonder how she would have felt in that moment, finally, being recognized by the country after all the hardships that she had endured and the feelings that she must have felt taking it for her mother, the throne that she truly felt that she deserved.
Nice. The reason I made a face there is that I met someone very special over the weekend, a historian called Dr. Peter Stivell, and he's obsessed with the story of Mary. And he's actually coming on the podcast next week, and he'll be very, very pleased to hear that someone said Mary's coronation rather than Elizabeth's, or indeed Anne Boleyn's. So is there a Tudor misconception that you would love to change?
Oh, there are so many. I think a Tudor misconception that I'd like to change is that Anne Boleyn, she pushed I hear it all the time that she pushed Henry into loving her, that she vied for this throne based on her family, that she had all of these ideas that she was going to be this grand queen and she wanted to oust Catherine. And I don't think that is true at all. We do know from written historical record that she actually ran away when Henry was trying to date her and engage with her. She did not want to engage with him.
Yeah.
And I think that he did love Catherine. I think that he just was vying for this, long sought after male heir that he felt that he couldn't have. And so he picked the younger woman that he could have this long sought after child with.
Absolutely. So we're here today to talk about Anne Boleyn, but in a particular lens, which is Anne Boleyn portraiture, a subject that I find fascinating. It's a complex subject, though, but it is one that people are really fascinated by. What is it that you think is driving the fascination with Anne's portraiture? Do you think it's down to the fact that, much like a lot of Anne herself, her portraiture is somewhat shrouded in mystery?
Yes, I also think that over time, people, especially just, speaking about myself, who was this woman who the king discarded his first wife for and his daughter, and gave up his connection to Rome. As we know, Henry was a staunch Catholic. This must have been incredibly difficult for him to do. We know that many of his advisors were against this. The church was against this. This could have led to wars, and he did it for her. And what we know of her image, especially later on, we have people saying that she had a sixth finger, that she had warts, and she was not a good look. That's kind of what the drive is, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, because you've covered this and essentially a study of the core list of Anne Boleyn images, be it sketches, portraits, and so on, in your a piece of work that you're due to be releasing soon, Anne Boleyn, History in Portraits. It's always struck me as sort of ironic, really, that she is unquestionably the most famous of Henry VIII's wives, and yet she's the one that we still tear ourselves apart over basics like what does she look like and when was she born. So it was a big part of your reasons for writing this book around Anne's portraits. Is it to try and get closer to understanding what did this woman actually look like to her contemporaries?
Yes, I also wanted to, I think it was really important to also discuss that there is a portrait, right? We know that there is a portrait in existence that was lost in the 1700s, that likely did go into a private collection. And I was trying to deduce, what happened to it.
And that will take up a big portion of the episode later on. It's really the crux of why you're here. It's what you've discovered, I think, and sort of stumbled upon is just fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that. The first image that you discussed, though, is the Most Happy Medal, which is, as of now, the only undoubted image of Anne Boleyn taken from life. Although it's damaged, what can we glean from this medal about Anne's appearance?
So in the Most Happy Medal, she is depicted as wearing the English gable hood. As we have heard from contemporaries, she was usually wearing the French fashion at court. And we know that when Jane Seymour took the throne, she stopped all of that. And she said, no, we are going to wear the English gable hood and we're going to be English here. And I think that that's important. In the Most Happy Medal, we see her with a cross around her neck. We see her in the English gable hood. I think this was a celebratory medal to signify something. I'm assuming maybe a pregnancy, or I'm not entirely sure what they were trying. I'm going to assume it was maybe a pregnancy of the purported male heir that would be coming. But she is dressed in the English fashion. She is wearing a crown. I think this was to show the people that she is most happy to be their queen and that she was a Christian and she was very English.
Yeah, and I think it's incredibly telling. People often talk about Anne Boleyn and the French hood and the fact that she didn't wear a gable hood. But firstly, we know she did because of this medal. But secondly, it's well documented that she wore a gable hood to her execution, which is a huge, I think, sign that this was a woman who on probably the second most momentous day after her coronation, that she chose to wear the gable hood, not the French hood. You also discuss the Hornbout miniature, which has been labelled as Anne Boleyn in the past, but increasingly, there are some who believe that it could actually be Anne's elder sister Mary. So can you discuss this miniature with me? What does it look like, and what do you think about it that leads it to being probably Mary rather than Anne?
So Mary's husband actually introduced the artist Lucas Hornbout to King Henry VIII, and he brought him to court many years before Anne was even in the picture. I think it's important that there is a miniature that was painted by Hornbout of Mary's husband, Sir William Carey, and it's actually facing, if you know, placing them side by side. If you place the miniatures side by side, they're actually facing each other. And so I believe, if, you know, considering that her husband had an image painted of himself by the artist, why wouldn't he have had a paired image painted of his wife?
Yeah, that would make sense. And it's always struck me as the conclusions about it being Anne. I've never really understood where that came from. It kind of felt like people were labeling it, but where is the proof? There's nothing in it to immediately suggest this could be Anne Boleyn, you know?
Yes, I think it's because of the image does feature a falcon, but it's not in the same way that Anne's falcon badge has been depicted, you know, in the ways that we know it to have been. I believe that in the miniature the falcon is depicted with, and Anne hadn't even adopted her falcon badge at this point that the portrait was allegedly created.
There's another feature to the miniature, and you may not know the answer to this, but what appears to be an actual fresh flower is pinned to the left outside of the gable hood. What do you make of this? Why is it there?
I've been looking at that flower for months now, and I cannot figure out what type of flower it is. We know that flowers in Tudor history have a lot of symbolism, but I cannot deduce what type of flower it is.
Yeah, because it's also it's something I haven't seen in other portraits of this, what looks to be a fresh flower effectively pinned on to the gable hood. I've not seen that elsewhere. So I'm just curious to know, you know, whether there was anything in it, but evidently not. Another miniature that you discuss is the Hoskins miniature. Now, this is created by John Hoskins. We know that for certain, and we know that it was created early in the 1600s. So what is this? You know, can you describe this particular miniature for me, and why does an inscription on the back of this specific image make it so significant, even though the picture is itself tiny?
So it is a miniature created by John Hoskins. It is one of the B series portraits. Anne is depicted wearing the pearls and the bee necklace that we know her to wear, as she has been described by her contemporaries. And again, as we see in the Bee Pendant portrait series, we do know that on the back of the portrait, it is labeled that this portrait was created based on an ancient original. So we know that there was a portrait in existence, and the painter has showcased to us that he did make a copy of that portrait.
Okay, so that alone tells us that this is potentially based on a contemporary, likely painted from life, and therefore this John Hoskins miniature could give us a very good indication of how Anne may have looked.
Yes, I mean, she's depicted with dark brown hair. She's wearing the black gown, the dark gowns that we see in the other Bee Pendant portraits, which we know were, you know, black was an incredibly expensive color during this time. She's wearing her bee, as we've seen depicted in the Bee Pendant series, and she has the dark eyes, which we know, as far as her contemporaries go, they did mention that her eyes were black and beautiful. Yes, and that this portrait, it as you've said a couple of times there, the Bee Pendant collection, effectively, there are many portraits that, I suppose, it's this image of Anne, just in different ways, is undoubtedly the blueprint, I suppose, of what we think of when we think of Anne Boleyn portraiture. One of the more controversial portraits that is said to depict Anne Boleyn is the Nid Hall portrait. The sitter appears a lot older than other images of Anne. The features are very heavy. It's got really heavy lidded eyes, big nose, quite a thin mouth. Something I've never noticed. You mentioned in your study is the fact that the brooch is actually really off-centre. I'd never noticed this until you pointed it out. Now I can't unsee it. What's going on there? Do you think this was just not a very good portrait and that the artist just got it wrong? What's going on with that, do you think? I do believe that the portrait was based on Queen Elizabeth's portraiture and her looks at the time. We do know that Elizabeth did not want to be reminded of her own aging. And so a lot of her portraits herself, they were painted to look a lot younger, even as Elizabeth aged. And if you follow the portraits, especially the bee pendant portraits and the Nidhall portrait, that were the ones that were painted during the lifetime and the reign of Elizabeth, you see that Anne begins to age with Elizabeth, and they are almost carbon copies of each other. I think what's important to note about the pendant is that the pearl, so she's wearing an AB pendant on her gown, and the pearl is sitting underneath the bee. It's not in the middle. And so the pendant wouldn't have sat like that if it was painted from life, just because gravity.
That makes sense. And the fact that it's off-centre as well, because there were some suggestions, weren't there, that the pendant may have been added at a later date, but you also are able to, well, you conclude that it wasn't and that it was part of the original painting.
Yeah, so I did enhance the image in the book, and just to try to find the brush strokes and to see the color pattern. I don't have access to the painting in real life, so that was the best that I could do. And you can, it's clear like where the shadowing is, and there is a little bit of blue that was added to give the pendant some shine. That pendant was added when the portrait was painted.
I'd like to dig into what you'd mentioned a moment ago about Anne's portraiture aging with Elizabeth's aging process as well. Can you give me a couple of other examples of that? And I suppose when we look at probably the two most famous portraits of Anne Boleyn, they are the Hever Rose and the National Portrait Gallery images, respectively. They are the core of the bee pendant series. You also, as I say, you mentioned the fact that these portraits and others are almost mirror images of portraits of Elizabeth through the years. So can you just dig into that in a bit more detail for me?
Yeah, so specifically like the Hever Rose portrait and then Elizabeth I Hampden portrait, they were painted around the same time, and putting them side by side, which I have also done in the book, they are nearly identical, same age. Moving forward with the National Portrait Gallery portrait of Anne, Anne does appear a little bit older, and Elizabeth's Phoenix portrait was painted around the same time. And again, side by side, they look exactly the same, which is where I got my idea to put the Nidhall portrait of Anne Boleyn next to Elizabeth Ditchley portrait, which she was much older, and they are identical again, except for, Elizabeth is dressed, and they are dressed in the clothing of their respective time periods. I think it's important that the love that the people had for Elizabeth, and then subsequently the respect they wanted to show to her mother. People were having these portraits painted to probably hang in their homes or to show that respect, maybe even gifts for Elizabeth. We don't know, but she was definitely not reminded of her age.
Yeah. So when you say about the faces in the Anne Boleyn portraits being identical to the ones of Elizabeth at those times, what are we talking about there? Are we saying the physical measurements of nose relative to eye? Is that where the similarities are?
Yeah, so it's specifically their face shape, their body size, their noses. There are slight deviations here and there just to differentiate them. But we also do know that Elizabeth, putting her portrait side by side with her father, she looked like her father. And especially after what happened to Anne, and there was this question about, Anne having remained faithful to Henry, there was no doubt that this was his daughter. And so I feel like maybe Elizabeth wanted to have some connection to her mom, wanted to look more like her mom, in that way.
Yeah, there's a portrait of Elizabeth at Hever Castle, actually, that looks almost nothing like other portraits of Elizabeth I, and it really throws people. But I discovered whilst I was there that it's because it was done to deliberately look like Henry. And so we know that was absolutely, in many ways, the truth of exactly what Elizabeth looked like didn't really matter. It was about reflecting that she was the legitimate daughter of Henry VIII. You discuss Holbein's Portrait of a Lady. Now, this is a sketch of an unknown woman. We think it depicts Anne Boleyn. There is a gable hood. This sketch bears a striking resemblance to the other Holbein sketch, which is inscribed as Anne Boleyn by Sir John Cheek. I was thrilled reading your book that, like me, you think this could be the real deal, that this is a contemporary of Anne Boleyn. So what is it about this sketch that leads you to that conclusion?
So Anne was described by a Venetian ambassador as having a very wide mouth, full lips and dark eyes. And we see that both portraits, the Holbein's portrait of a lady and the Windsor sketch, if you take away, the Windsor sketch, she is dressed, she's not wearing a hood. She seems to be dressed in her undergarments. It may have for Henry is what I personally believe. And then we have Holbein's portrait of a lady in which she is dressed up. She is wearing a hood. She is wearing a nice dress. As far as we can tell. I think that if you take away these things and you look specifically at the face, which I did, I put them side by side. You see that the nose is identical. The eyes are identical. They are lidded. They are heavy. She's got this full mouth, and this pretty, full. She has a fuller face. But I think one thing that's really important is that because they were drawn by the same person, she's got a bump on her nose in both pictures, which he wasn't just putting bumps on people's noses in pictures.
Well, the other thing that I like about... I struggle with the Windsor sketch, but I struggle with it because I think I'm projecting. I don't want Anne Boleyn to look like... to have this big double chin and everything. Because in that sketch, the sitter has a double chin. It's just not, I suppose, what we picture Anne Boleyn to be, but that is me projecting. Firstly. Secondly, it was a preparatory sketch. She's potentially heavily pregnant. So it's difficult to say. And I know that, Owen Emerson, for example, is absolutely convinced that it is definitely the Windsor sketch is unquestionably Anne from life. The thing that I like about the other one, the sketch of Holbein's portrait of a woman as well, is that if you look at it, there's a sketch which might be George Boleyn by Holbein. And again, it might be. But if you compare that sketch of what is potentially George Boleyn against the portrait of a lady by Holbein, there is a strong familial link in those faces, which for me is, again, maybe slightly more evidence that it could be Anne. And that would therefore be George. But who can say? Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Yes, I do. And I would actually be interested at this point in putting them side by side and then taking Hornback's miniature that I believe is Mary, and seeing what those look like to all three of them. Yes,
because you also include in your book the portrait that's well known as being Mary Boleyn. You don't think it's Mary Boleyn at all, right?
I do not believe that cannot possibly be Mary.
This is going to be controversial for a lot of people.
It is, but she's depicted in ermine. Why would Anne Boleyn's sister, who was mistress of a king and then ended up marrying someone who didn't have much money, was actually, personally told, do not return to court, had to pawn her jewelry in order to survive. Why would she be depicted in ermine? Yeah,
because it is a further reserve of royalty. I wonder why that's never been picked up on. Like, why has no one picked up on that until now?
I think there's this idea that, people really, truly want to have picture, because maybe if we had a picture of Mary, it'd be better. It would be easier to deduce what Anne looked like because they were sisters. And we don't really have pictures of the rest of the family. I mean, even their cousin, Catherine Howard, she as well. We don't really know what she looked like. We have all these questions again. Instead, with the other queens, we know absolutely what they looked like.
We're here to really, the big part of this conversation is around the missing portrait of Anne Boleyn and some, at the moment, conjecture from yourself. What you suggest, I think, has huge meat on the bone. And so what we're talking about is the missing Lumley portrait of Anne Boleyn. So to start, before we get into a conversation about your findings, what is the Lumley portrait and why was it so significant?
So the Lumley portrait we know was a portrait, a full-length, full-body portrait of Anne Boleyn that was hanging at her childhood home of Hever Castle. We know that after her demise, everything was scrubbed. of her. So any portraits that were in existence, they were taken down, they were taken away, but this remained inside of Hever. And we know that because Anne of Cleves, when she ended up with Hever after her divorce and after Anne's parents passed away, had this portrait in her possession quietly, which I just find remarkable, because this could have been so terrible for her. But she ends up willing the portrait to Henry Fitzalan, who was her executor and friend. And then he ends up passing away and willing the portrait to his son-in-law, John Lumley, first Baron Lumley, and that's where we get the name, the Lumley portrait.
Okay, so we're talking about a full length of Anne Boleyn painted from life that hung at Hever Castle for a time. You trace the portrait's journey from creation right through to the last time that it was definitively recorded. So how did you discover that route from who it went to? Was it quite well recorded?
So it's not as well recorded as because the portrait just goes missing entirely in 1773, and it goes missing with the James West collection. When that was sold, it vanishes. But we do know that the portrait was damaged by fire. It was likely at the Middle Temple Gate. We know that it went back to the monarchy at one point, and it was hanging and on display, and then it ended up catching fire, and so it had to be cut from bust up, because they ended up losing a significant portion of the painting.
Okay, and that was because you also traced that was during the reign of Charles II, I believe?
Yes.
Okay, and then so it sold privately in 1773, and thereafter it vanishes.
Yes.
Okay, so to the next step. In 1926, a portrait of Anne Boleyn is photographed by the Howard Young Gallery. Now, this photograph, as I say, is a photograph of a portrait. We don't have the original, at least to the best of our knowledge. The photograph's in sepia. We can't say for certain what colours are in this portrait because the photograph's in sepia, but it's clearly in line with and the basis for the other B pendant series. So describe this portrait for me. What is it we're seeing in this photograph?
So when you look at the photograph without enhancement, because I did further enhance the portrait. So without any enhancement, we have Anne Boleyn depicted. We can tell the hair must be dark, based on the kind of sepia color tone that we see. She is depicted with dark eyes. She is depicted as wearing the pearls with the B pendant, a very nice dress, and she has a French hood on her head. And above, on the top, there's an inscription that reads, Anna, Queen, second wife of Henry VIII, in Latin.
As I say, it's very clearly, probably the basis for, if we're accepting that this could be an original, is the basis for the B pendant series, because so much chimes. There is the French hood, what is a black dress, a black French hood, the B necklace, the pearls, all of those things are absolutely there, essentially.
Yes, but there are some notable key differences in the Howard Young Gallery, picture of a portrait that we see that are so different than the other B pendant series portraits. Yeah,
which is what I think makes this so exciting. So in 1940, a portrait of Anne Boleyn surfaces, and it's sold to Anne Gould, Duchess of Talleyrand Perigord. Maybe I'm pronouncing that right. This portrait has become known as the Lyndhurst portrait. So it's your firm belief that the Lyndhurst is in fact long lost Lumley. Is that correct?
Yes, I think the Lyndhurst is an overpainting of that Howard Young portrait, because we do know, so if you there is no history on the Howard Young portrait, where it came from. There's no information, and where it went. And then we have the Lyndhurst portrait showing up and placing them on top of each other, which I was unable to show in the book, but I did place them side by side. They are everything down to the mere inches and centimeters is exactly the same. It's the exact same amount of pearls on the neck. It's when I enhanced the portrait, even the lines are very similar. I mean, they are identical to each other.
Yeah. They really, really are. And I think that's what makes this such an intriguing possibility. So to just go back over it for anyone who maybe is getting a touch confused here, we've got a photograph of a portrait of Anne Boleyn. The photograph is taken in 1926. 14 years later, a portrait of Anne Boleyn surfaces that has become known as the Lyndhurst portrait. And your belief is that whatever this portrait that was photographed in 1926 is, the later portrait that surfaces and becomes known as the Lyndhurst is the portrait photographed 14 years earlier, but with overpaint over the top, which makes the two look marginally different.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I mean, looking at both images side by side, as you say, it's undeniable. So you mentioned a couple of intriguing features about the Lyndhurst portrait and how they differ, I suppose, from the other bee pendant series portraits of Anne Boleyn. And a key one being the way that the pearls below the bee pendant fall. And it's actually it's a small thing, but it's quite a significant thing. But what is it I'm talking about here?
So in all the other bee pendant series portraits, you see they are perfect, hanging beneath the bee, and there is always shadowing behind them. If the pendant were sitting upon a chest, it wouldn't contain a shadow, as if it's detached from the body. And in the Howard and the Lyndhurst portraits, the pearls are splayed against the chest. They are sitting directly on the chest, and they are not perfect. So they are not hanging perfectly as if, upon a hook.
So in essence, what you're saying is the fact that they're splayed, it just adds weight to this is being painted from life, because pearls wouldn't hang. But in a natural setting, this is how pearls would hang. They wouldn't just drop down in the way they do.
Right, especially with how large those pearls are, as we are aware from the bee pendant, series of portraits. Those pearls were quite large. This necklace was probably heavy. They are splayed against her chest without any shadowing underneath. And I think that's important, because that's not something that an artist would have considered to try to make it more lifelike. I believe the other artists who did paint the other bee pendant series portraits, they just wanted to showcase the bee necklace. And it wasn't, how do we make this more alive?
So what we're talking about here then really is the real possibility that the Lumley portrait that vanishes, we have the photograph taken in 1926 of a portrait of Anne Boleyn, and you believe that photograph is of the Lumley portrait, and then the Lyndhurst is the Lumley portrait with overpainting gone over the top. So why is overpainting done? Is it something that we can sort of scrape back if needs be?
If this is the Lumley portrait and it was damaged by fire, it likely that the colorization would have been off. Maybe they didn't have the techniques at the time to clean a painting, more like what we've seen with the Anne of Cleves painting at the Louvre. We didn't even realize that the background was blue. It was kind of like a dingy green. And then all of those embellishments on her hood suddenly shone through when they cleaned the portrait. I don't think that at this time, maybe they just weren't, those types of techniques were not available. And so somebody tried to save the portrait by trying to recreate the colors and what they believed, but they did miss something. And that is the Tudor roses that appear on the Howard Young Gallery portrait. There are Tudor roses on the breast, which is very, very different from the other bee pendant series portraits.
Yeah, I was going to discuss that, because you, as part of your research and what you've done when looking at the photograph of the Howard Young portrait, you've digitally enhanced it, you've colorized it, and as you say, around the detailing part of the dress, around the chest, where we normally see beads and things like that, you have brought out what are clearly Tudor roses fully decorating around Anne's chest in this dress. That's very different from other interpretations of Anne that we see in portraiture. And the fact that it's the Tudor rose, that's a really big find that you've spotted there.
Yes, I was so excited to see it. I just wanted to see, if I was attempting things, let's clarify the image a bit. Let's colorize the image. I put it through multiple programs, and then I said, you know what, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to do this by hand. So I brought it into Photoshop, and I slowly, layer by layer, tried to peel away some of that like dingy background of the 1926 portrait. I mean, it is a picture that was taken in 1926, and what I realized when I was clarifying the image, trying to see what exactly was there, that the Tudor rose started emerging.
And I think that's what's also fascinating about this portrait is that when we look at one of the reasons why I've never liked, for example, the Hever Rose portrait of Anne Boleyn is that I don't think it looks like a human being. And that might sound a bit silly, but if you look at the features in that one in particular, I think less so in the National Portrait Gallery image, although the lips are absurdly small, the features are just too weird, as particularly in the Hever Rose. It doesn't look like an actual person. But this portrait and the work you've done in digitally enhancing it, you can see a human being. You can see clearly a face that makes sense. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, can you see what I mean by that?
Yes. She is my Anne Boleyn. I believe that this is contemporary. I think this is her. I think this is a woman that, yes, Henry would have broke with the church for.
Yeah, because you conclude in your book that the artist is potentially Hughes Van Cleve, and that it was made as part of a set that was created. Also, we know obviously there is the famous Hughes Van Cleve of Henry VIII. It's actually my favourite portrait of Henry. And you think that there's a very good chance that this was actually a set, and that this portrait of Anne Boleyn was painted while she was in Calais with Henry?
Hughes Van Cleve did paint him in 1532. We know that she was there. We know that he brought her there to introduce her to France, that this was, a point of pride for him, a momentous occasion. He even elevated her to the peerage, a title that was extinct. And he gave that to her. And I think that because I think that also explains the bee pendant series is, if she was his wife, if she was Queen of England, when the original bee pendant portrait was painted, she wouldn't have had a bee. She would have likely been wearing the Queen's jewels. She would have been wearing a cross. It would have been something else. I feel that the painting must have been created then, and we know that it was hanging at Hever Castle. So it's not something that he had in his home. This is something that her parents put up in pride.
And I've always thought that if any of the bee pendant portraits are contemporary, to your point, that they wouldn't have been post 1533, because as Queen, she's a Boleyn still, but she's not going to be advertising it in the way that you would be when you're rising through the ranks, when you're made Marquess of Pembroke. That is a moment to celebrate, and the moment at which it's still appropriate to showcase the fact that you are a Boleyn, rather than, she wouldn't have had a T for Tudor, but I get what you mean, and I've often wondered that that is quite a significant thing, that she wouldn't have been having that post becoming Queen. My final question for you then, with regard to this portrait and your findings, is what's next? Have you spoken to the folks that have the Lyndhurst? Is there any further research being done? Is there a plan that you would like to try and put in place to get to the bottom of this?
Yes. So my first attempt was to publish my findings. I thought that was important. And then obviously being here with you. And my next step is I would like to go to New York. And I would like to go to the Lyndhurst Mansion. I would like to see it for myself. I do plan on talking to them. I do plan on sending them a copy of the book. I hope that, somebody who has access, who works to restore paintings would take a chance and look at it. Obviously, we don't want to hurt the Lyndhurst as it is, because it is its own painting. But if we could get clarification with all the new technology that we have, we may actually have answers about her face.
Well, that's, we wouldn't need to necessarily strip away overpainting. You can X-ray easily enough to determine what's beneath, and you can also then date the wood. That is the sort of the go-to in being able to age a portrait, and those things would absolutely be something that could be done. And if you could age the wood and you can see from an x-ray, if you're able to x-ray the Lyndhurst and what comes through is the Howard Young, then it's almost like case closed, really. The basis for our conversation has been about your book, Anne Boleyn, A History in Portrait. So when will people be able to get their hands on this, and what else are you working on?
Thank you for asking. It is available wherever books are sold. Currently, the most popular place to get the book from is Amazon. And my next book is actually Anne of Cleves, A History in Portraits.
Wonderful. That was what you mentioned this a few moments ago about the portrait of Anne of Cleves in the Louvre. Who knew that was underneath there all this time? That we all just sort of saw this drab, sort of pondy green background, and actually there was this beautiful blue underneath. I think the whole world was shocked when that came out.
Yes, and the details of the pearls on her hood. That's something that I personally never noticed before.
Yeah, that's why. That's also, it's just proof that how much cleaning can make a change to the way we picture a portrait. So thank you so much again for coming on and discussing that all with me. That's great.
Thank you, Adam.
Well, that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to Elizabeth LaVasse for coming on to share her theories with me. And I'm sure that many of you will have listened to this episode with your mouths hanging open and are now frantically Googling the Lumley portrait and the Lyndhurst portrait. Next week, I'm going to be jumping from the world of Anne Boleyn into that of her one-time stepdaughter, the woman who would grow up to be the first crowned Queen Regnant in English history, Queen Mary I. I will be joined by Dr. Peter Steffel, an expert in Mary and her imagery in print and paintings and so on. That will drop next Thursday, by which point I also hope that I won't sound like I've been smoking 100 Lambert and Butler a day since I was 7 years old. I've never been a smoker in my life, contrary to how I may currently sound. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and speak soon.